Okay, so with America into the war, and remember that the troops in the U.S. from the U.S. really started arriving in large numbers in 1918. So one of the things that the Americans did differently was after Pershing's experience of chasing Pancho Villa around Mexico unsuccessfully, as well as dealing with the Indian Wars on the Great Plains of the United States, Pershing really came to understand the value of constant movement in an offensive and ongoing campaign. And as a result, the Americans simply would not stay in the trenches. They would not do this thing of we're just going to take the trench and sit here and wait a few days. And nope, it was we take the trench. Great, we just keep going after that. And the Browning automatic rifle really was a big aid in allowing them to do this. Now, the arrival of the Americans was really just about providentially timed. In the spring of 1918, the Germans unleash the last great offensive of the war, the Spring Offensive, and it's one of two. It's sort of a two-part attack in an effort to attempt to take Paris. The Germans had shifted around three-quarters of a million troops into France from Russia, and these troops were veterans of fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russians. They were battle hardened, they knew what to do, and it employed a sort of new strategy on the part of the Germans, known as the stormtroopers. And unlike the guys from Star Wars, these could actually hit what they were shooting at. The stormtroopers, not unlike the Americans, were more or less designed to continue to move and not stay put. Additionally, the Germans strategically targeted what they felt was the weakest point in the Allied lines, which would have been the Americans. Excuse me. And early in the Spring Offensive, the the German tactics prove incredibly successful. They are able to push into Allied territory and actually begin to make the war move. The first real stop that the Germans encountered was at the Battle of Cantigny. Cantigny was a French town that the Germans occupied um, and had been occupying for a while. The Americans took the town in a half an hour, and not only did they take it, but they were able to successfully defend it against a German counterattack. The success of the Battle of Cantigny convinced the British and the French that the Americans were actually reliable and would be able to hold up their own. These were followed up by the battles of Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, which were two small areas that the Germans had taken on their way to attempt to get to France. They were within 30 or 40 miles of France of Paris at this point in time. Sorry, and particularly at Belleau Wood, the Americans refused to follow French orders and to retreat. Instead, the Americans held their ground, and not only did they defeat the Germans, they retook the areas from the Germans that they had captured. Significant um, battles for the Americans in terms of a big lasting effect. The Battle of Saint Mihiel during the Spring Offensive. Saint Mihiel was a town in France that had been held by the Germans for nearly 3 years. The French had lost it early in 1915. The Americans retook the town in 3 days. And it was a coordinated effort on the part of the Americans. This, by the way, the Battle of Saint Mihiel is the only one led, planned out, and directed by the Americans. It coordinated heavy artillery assaults of tanks and cannons, air attacks by planes, and direct frontal assault by infantry together in order to retake the town. The largest battle for the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, lasting a total of 47 days, was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the last great battle of the war. It's also the second highest death toll in U.S. history for a battle, behind the Battle of Gettysburg. The Americans held the Meuse River and the Argonne area, the hilly, foresty area of the Argonne, and eventually took them back from the Germans. It was this victory at the Meuse Argonne that led to the point that Germany could no longer replace troops that it had lost. And negotiations began to end the war. It was agreed by all sides that the war would officially end on November the 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. On November the 10th, the Kaiser, the Emperor of Germany, was forced to resign his throne and leave Germany. Both sides agreed to cease fighting. However, the fighting actually got kind of worse up until the last minutes of the war because both sides were attempting to have as much territory as possible to negotiate from a position of strength. And as I mentioned in class, the really sad thing is that we actually know the name of the last man killed in World War One. He, I think he was a Canadian guy, and he was shot at like 10:59 a.m. Literally a minute before the ceasefire took place. And after that, they just basically stopped shooting. Um, Let me just check here to make sure for you on the just a little. The last man killed in the war was Henry Gunter, um, an American, was killed at 10:59 a.m., which is really, really, really very sad. So, with the war officially ended, we can talk about the peace. Now, to be very clear about this, and this is a technical point, but it's kind of really important to understand. The armistice was not a surrender; it was a ceasefire, and the Germans genuinely believed that they were going into a peace conference and peace negotiation where everybody would be regarded as more or less equal, especially because that was kind of the mantra or the like talking points of Woodrow Wilson. That's not what they got. So the conference is held in the small French town of Versailles outside the city of Paris. There's a very significant reason for this, which is that Versailles was the location of Louis XIV's great summer palace, which the Germans had used to crown the first German emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm I, in 1871 and create a unified German nation. They did that to sort of aggravate the French. So, this is where the peace conference is going to be held. There are a total of 32 nations or groups of people represented at the peace conference. The only one of the Central Powers, the bad guys, the Triple Alliance people present, were the Germans. The Austro-Hungarians, the Ottoman Empire, and the Bulgarians, who had joined in later, all made separate peace agreements with the Allies. Russia, because it had dropped out of the war, was not present. Germany was there, but the German representatives were basically told to stay in their hotel room until the Allies were ready to summon them in and tell them what the terms were. It is a very different Europe than had existed 5 years earlier. So when the fighting started in 1914, Europe was made up of a group of empires and alliance systems. In early 1919, when the peace conference starts, four empires are completely gone: Germany, the Austro Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire are no more. They are dissolved. And even with the big war being over, the little wars were not. As soon as the gigantic fight between, the Germans and everybody else was over, the little ethnic and national groups went back to killing each other. Into this chaos came Woodrow Wilson, who believed that he was the only man who could come in and effectively negotiate and make this great vision of utopia that he had actually a reality. It was a little arrogant, maybe more than a little arrogant, and very high minded, and really condescending, the belief that, number one, nobody else could do it, and number two, that he somehow would have the ability to overpower the Europeans with his mere presence. Despite the fact that there are 32 countries or 32 groups of people at the conference, there's only five that really make a big difference. And of these five, most people focus on the European and Western contingent, the what are known as the Big Four. So these men are British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. Prime Minister is like a president. My general rule of thumb is anybody who's got more than one first name as like their or as a first name as a last name really can't be trusted. He's got three first names. George Clemenceau, Premier of France, also like a president. That's what the office of Premier is. Gorgeous Georges. Vittorio Orlando, Premier of Italy. Now, the Italians had basically been thrown out of the war. They had more or less gotten beat up by the Austrians, but because, they were on the winning side, they showed up as the winner. And Woodrow Wilson, US President. Collectively, these four men are known as the Big Four. Unpause. There is a fifth one, however, and that is Saionji Kinmochi, a marquise and former Prime Minister of Japan. Now, these men have specific agendas and specific things that they want to see. And it's fairly safe to say that of these five men, the only one who was really unrealistic about what was going to happen was Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson was not well received by the Europeans. The European people loved him. The European leaders found him more than slightly arrogant and condescending. I mentioned this in class, but George Clemenceau, the French premier, made a comment something to the extent of, even God only gave us 10 commandments. Wilson's got 14. Every one of these people has something that they want, except honestly, kind of maybe for Woodrow Wilson, who genuinely believed he was showing up to treat everybody with fairness and equity and stuff. Um, and that really wasn't the reality of any of it. So, part of what made Wilson less than well received was a speech that he had given in January of 1918 that outlined his vision of the future and the creation of sort of a almost like a utopian society known And his speech was known as the 14 points. It was 14 rules or conditions or observations that would be applied to the future to create a new order in Europe. These 14 points can be basically narrowed down to five main concepts. The first one, the ending of empires and the readjustment of national borders. The second one, self determination of all people. When you readjust national borders, you will give people the right to choose what kind of government and what kind of policies that they want to follow. Freedom of the seas and respect for neutrality. This is obviously a big point for America because of Germany's use of submarines against our shipping. No more secret alliances. Because remember, secrets are no fun. Secrets started World War One, and we're not going to do that again. And finally, last but not least, the greatest thing ever, the big kahuna, the whole enchilada, the pièce de résistance, the magnum opus, the League of Nations, an international kind of world government that would oversee the all the countries of the world and establish peace and order and lawlessness, or lawfulness, I should say. Sorry, Freudian slip there. We're not overly impressed by Wilson and his idealism. They thought he was kind of naive, and quite frankly, they thought he was an arrogant idiot, and they really didn't appreciate that. For his part, the one thing that Woodrow Wilson wants more than anything is his League of Nations down here, and he's willing to give up on everything else just to get his League of Nations. Wait, we're going to stop here for this part, and then we'll go on to the next one. Peace and love.